Today, we're taking a journey through civil rights history to illuminate how self-sufficiency and economic empowerment have always been a part of the Black experience. Whether striving for the American dream or the dream Dr. King alluded to, there have always been visionaries working to realize the dream. For this episode, entitled The Dream Realized, Economic Power and Wealth Building, we have three experts, Alphonso David, Tamira Chapman, and Jane Oates, who are continuing this work. They will bring context and draw connections from the past to today as we are guided through the museum experience. So much of what we know about American capitalism is based on the labor of enslaved people or an underclass of servitude. What evidence of this do we see today?
To anyone who is looking to see the images or the vestiges of slavery in this country, look at every single building that is standing. Because every single building that is standing in this country was either built by slaves or influenced by the underclass. And when we go into cities and counties across this country, we don't appreciate that these buildings exist to a large extent because they were built on the backs of marginalized communities. And that, for me, is a reminder of the vestiges of slavery and discrimination and bias that we continue to live with today.
And I would just say, I think the occupational segregation is still so apparent. I mean, still too few Black lawyers, Black doctors, way too few Black investment bankers on Wall Street. No offense to New York. But I mean, and really, if you look at the CEOs in this country of the Fortune 1500 companies, you have to look really hard to find a face of color. And that's just indicative, in 2024, that we haven't come close to equity or equality.
We're hard pressed to look at any industry and not identify where we've seen folks from an underserved population show up and another group be able to take full advantage of that. The one that just comes to mind so easily for me is just like the healthcare system. The education systems, it's just prominent everywhere that we look.
Yeah, and certainly the inequalities in healthcare, unbelievable. You look at maternal death rates between white and Black moms, and it shouldn't be. I mean, the death rate, the survival rate, the infant mortality of Black babies in this country is like a third world country. It's not like what white Americans experience.
I feel like we're standing on sacred ground here. We had one of our most revered leaders killed not too far from where we're standing. And as I think about Martin Luther King, when he gave his speech on the March on Washington in the 60s, we talk about the wealth gap. The wealth gap was 8-1 between white Americans and Black Americans. And today is 12-1. And so, although people talk about progress, I think we need to think about how you define that progress, because the disparity among Black people and white people in this country is increasing when we talk about the wealth gap. I'm not talking about how much I earn and how much you earn. There's disparities there as well. But whether or not Black people are accumulating assets in this country, we are seeing a growing gap between Black Americans and white Americans. And I think that's of concern.
I would agree with that, and I would just even say, even in a housing market. So when you get ready to move through so many of our communities, we recognize that there is not a lot of home ownership, but there's a reason for that. Mm-hmm. And it's because we haven't always had access to capitals, haven't had access to the loans. And so what we find is that other people tend to own the land that's in our community. And essentially all of that equity is being passed from one generation to the next outside of our community. I would also say the same is true for all commerce that's happening in our community. And so when we look at why this gap may exist today, I think that part of that is because back in the 60s and back in the 70s, we were forced to pretty much live among each other. And so we had an opportunity to circulate the Black dollar so much more. And the moment desegregation started to take place, the first thing that happened is we moved out to some of these other neighborhoods and we started to disperse our dollars within other communities. It's been very hard to retain and to get that back.
I think there were really deliberate policies to make sure it wasn't just accidental. I mean, you look at redlining, that was real. You know, you look at the lack of, people talk about food deserts now, there's banking deserts in Black communities. I mean, so of course they were underbanked, you know, or unbanked, and therefore they weren't allowed to develop, you know, build a credit rating. They weren't allowed to accumulate interest. I mean, and most of the jobs they were in, even until today, I'm afraid, don't have 401ks. You know, many Black semi-professionals, I would call government workers, postal workers. I think they're professionals, but they're not. They're certainly not the elite. They have fixed pension plans, and that's going to change things. But it's changing things at an incremental pace.
And to those that are saying, well, you know, we really think that Black people need to pull themselves out from the bootstraps. We hear the bootstraps argument all the time. I would say to them, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the U.S. government provided land to white people in the West, but not to Black people. So when we're talking about building generational wealth, no one wants to talk about the past. But when we go out to certain parts of this country and acres and acres and acres of land are owned by white people, there's a reason. So you can't divorce what's happening today from what happened in the past.
And again, intentional destruction of Blacks amassing wealth. Look at Tulsa. And everybody goes, oh, well, that was just, you know, a little thing. It was an intentional destruction of Black business and Black wealth building.
Because of segregation, Black professionals and entrepreneurs thrived in Black communities where patrons could shop with dignity. We see the rise of wealth in communities like Greenwood in Tulsa, Mound Bayou in Mississippi, until racism decimated their businesses. What lessons could we learn from that tragic past?
I think the most important lesson is to keep at it. So if we built it once, we can build it again. And I think that it's the sort of model that needs to be replicated everywhere. And the more often we do it, and the more of us that come together to build out these collective communities. So if we think about everything that we may need in a 5-mile radius, we want to make sure we've got a couple doctors, we want a couple dentists. You know, we'd like to have access to some grocery stores, some gas stations, and all of those things are owned by the people that live in that community. I think that we start to build that collective wealth again. And if that model is replicated at scale, it becomes less easy to just, you know, drop a bomb in Tulsa. Essentially, you'd have to wipe out the whole of America in order to eradicate this sort of thinking if it's done the right way and at scale. So I think that the lessons that I take away from it is we have everything that we need to be successful today. Like, I'm not sure that there's a conversation where we need so much help from the outside. I think that if Black people could simply be left alone to just thrive, that they would do just that. And I think that that's really the opportunity that's been missing. When we see African Americans working to get ahead, I think what we find is a knee on the neck. And I think that that is indicative of what we're seeing today with DE&I when we look at organizations like the Fearless Fund. And Fearless was working so hard, understanding that Black women are the most founded but the least funded. And so the hope there is, if we can't get the whole of America to give us venture capital dollars, can we instead start to fund ourselves? That group made that attempt, and we see just a couple of days ago, a court of appeal said that the work that they were doing was found to be unlawful. And so we can do it, you know, but it would be great if there was not always a knee on the neck and a bomb that was sent our way when we attempt to pull ourselves up by bootstraps. And the final piece of it is we just got to keep going. I think that there's a quote here on the wall that really sums it up great when it says, Black men, you were once great and you shall be great again. Just got to keep at it.
I think I'll focus on the Fearless Fund specifically. I have the privilege of representing the Fearless Fund in court. So you have two Black women created a venture capital firm, created a charitable organization to address a disparity that exists in the venture capital space, as she just said. And to put a finer point on it, we have $288 billion that's allocated every single year in the venture capital space. And less than 0.036% goes to Black women. Less than 1% goes to Black people. So they decided to open up a company and a charitable organization to try to address that disparity. And they were sued. But by an organization claiming to represent 3 plaintiffs. We don't know their names. We don't know if they have legitimate businesses. We don't know if they have addresses. And now we are faced with a decision that says that this granting process, this charitable organization that's looking to provide support, can no longer provide that support. Now, why is that important to you? That's important to you because if you own a business, what this court is telling you is that anyone can file a lawsuit against your business with anonymous plaintiffs and try to shut you down, and you don't know who they are. Why this is important to you because if you are giving dollars to the NAACP or any charitable organization, you may be precluded from doing that in the future. So we need to think about when we see these cases where individuals are being targeted to see ourselves in those cases, because it's not just about the Fearless Fund. It's about all of us. And when we talk about economic opportunity, to what she was talking about in terms of building an ecosystem that's sustainable, we have to make sure we see ourselves in all of these challenges that we are seeing all across the country.
The thing too that I loved about the Fearless Fund, the 2 founders didn't even come from that background. They simply saw a need in the market, went and studied, learned everything they could, took a step away from things that was lucrative and paying them, and made the decision to stand up for Black women and be the answer. And this was the thanks that they managed to get. So I agree with you. We have to find a way for everybody to see themselves in the sort of problems that we're facing today.
And no one has any problem with all-white venture groups giving to all-white I mean, no one sees any problem there. And yet venture funds give 99% of their money to white entrepreneurs.
The story had always been that the rest of us aren't at the table, right? Like, well, there's no one else here asking for the dollars. But I think the data that we have from the Fearless Fund teaches us otherwise. We were there and at the door knocking. You chose not to answer. I think it's a big difference.
And many of the businesses were small dollar asks. They weren't asking for $10 million. Some of them were asking for $100,000 just to buy inventory.
So I think today the Fearless Fund represents that modern day bomb in Tulsa, right? It's just a different way to get at the same.
That's exactly right.
Women domestic workers who took the buses to work were the key to the success of the Montgomery bus boycott. As the primary customers of the city buses, the strategy to activate the customer base to empower the community is a strategy for change. In what ways do we see similar grassroots empowerment making positive changes today?
Well, I think there are a few that we can point to. One, looking at the labor movement. We're still struggling in this country with understanding that there's a fundamental difference between minimum wage and a livable wage. And labor unions are actually at the forefront of affecting that discussion and having people really confront, can you really live off minimum wage in most large cities in this country? And in many cases you can't. You have to have multiple jobs. So I think labor unions are serving a meaningful service to marginalized communities all over the country. And there are many others. I think young people are doing a lot on climate because we're seeing that it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter in many parts of the country. And whether you believe in climate change or not, you have to acknowledge that we're seeing a lot more natural disasters. And I think we're seeing young people take an active role in affecting policy across the country, and how people think about environmental justice has changed as well.
I just want to call out a couple of women who I think are doing amazing work now. I mean, Linda Goler-Blunt, who's really bringing attention, she's the head of the National Institute for Black Women's Health, based in Atlanta, and really talking about why we haven't made any progress on certain diseases that impact the Black community. Why Blacks aren't more represented in clinical trials, why they are. These are these are 21st century problems. I love what Fatima Goss-Graves is doing, the head of the National Women's Law Center,
She's
right?
fantastic.
I mean, she's like a force of nature and not afraid, just like Rosa Parks wasn't afraid, to have people call her names or disdain her. So, I mean, I think that spirit, not to diminish Black men, there's fabulous Black men. I grew up in Philadelphia, the other Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Leon Sullivan, Reverend Sullivan was amazing, talking about the discrepancies in workforce training for blacks and whites. Why blacks were underrepresented. You talked about unions. In the trades unions, they could be laborers and carry the bricks, but they couldn't be carpenters and finish things and make the real money. And Dr. Sullivan started to change that in Philadelphia, and it exploded. So I mean, there's still modern day examples of amazing courage, people willing to stand up harder even today, I think. I mean, Rosa Parks saw the anger around her in a limited geographic area. Now with the 24-hour news cycle, you can be lambasted 24 hours a day on 16 different channels.
And let's add April Verrett to that.
Oh, I
Many
agree.
people
Yeah,
who don't
that's right.
know.
April Verrett.
April Verrett is the first black woman to lead SEIU, which is the
Yep.
largest labor union in the country.
That's
Absolutely.
exactly right.
So I can't believe
As
I
of a
missed
few
her.
weeks ago. As of
She
a
was
few
just
weeks
elected,
ago.
right?
Just elected.
Elected by her peers.
So when we think about, because many people don't realize how our history, what we're here to talk about, is so close to our present. And for her to be the first black woman to run that labor organization tells us a lot. We have many firsts that we still have yet to realize.
I would also add voting rights, at least getting out,
Oh, yeah.
getting out the vote campaigns. I think that what we saw in the last election and what we're likely to see in this election is that we've got a lot of African American women that are on the front line doing everything they can to register new folks to vote, make sure folks have rights into the polls, to make sure that we absolutely have our voice heard at the polls. And I would again add the work that's happening in the VC space,
Oh, yeah.
at the Fearless Fund.
During the Black Power movement, the emphasis was on self-sufficiency, community control, and self-defense. The free breakfast program and the schools were the brainchild of this movement that the federal government implemented in the 1970s. What creative economic strategies have you seen implemented today?
I would say the creation of Black-owned businesses, right? So I think that what we see today in the data is that we have, especially Black women, founding more businesses than anybody else. And I think that the message that we're attempting to send is that we can understand a problem, we can look at the needs of community, and we can show up and we can solve it. So that's one that I see that is just recurring. And I think that that's been happening for the last couple of decades as well. And I think that what we're starting to realize is there's a concept of trying to serve everyone or just serving your community really well, because you could have a very successful business that is taking care of the needs of the people that are in that community, putting them to work and continuously circulating the dollar. So I think programs like that lunch program that the Black Panthers did, I can liken that immediately to the creation of Black businesses that are in the community. It's just different verticals today.
You know, when you think of technology, often you don't see black faces, but there are so many black faces that are involved in innovation, involved in advancing technology, not only here in the United States, but also globally. And as we think about emerging industries and fields, we have so many people of color, and specifically black people, that are involved in innovative strategies and solutions to some of the most challenging problems we face.
And I think that's incredibly important right now, because we saw at the early stages of facial recognition that blacks just weren't recognized by the algorithm. So getting more people of color into the space of writing and creating those algorithms, or AI could do more damage than good, period.
Folks tend to solve problems like when there's proximity. So I think the sort of businesses that we develop would absolutely change if we were in proximity to the problems. So I think that if we were sitting close to fintech, or if we're sitting close to AI, that we'll have ideas that are just as good, sharp, and fundable as the others. But part of the problem is we're historically locked out of those tables. And because that's the case, sometimes those are not the solutions that we generally see being brought forward. But it's not to say that it's not possible. It's just saying that we need to democratize problems.
You know, there's this ongoing debate right now about diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's, you know, the far right is proposing a demise or an end or an eradication of D&I. But what they're doing is ignoring the data, because we have decades of data that shows that businesses that have diverse teams are more innovative and it increases the bottom line. So if you are a CEO and you're running a corporation and you know that a more diverse team will mean higher revenues, and you ignore the data, that means that you are driving inherent bias in your company, in your culture, and ultimately you will end up making less revenues and you will end up being less innovative.
Yeah, and if you can't do it for the right reason, I mean,
Do it for the profits.
do it for the profits, because the bottom line is when you employ black people are likely to come to your business. So if you were a bank that had a great, diversity program saying we're going to do at least this, if you're a venture capital firm that says we're going to hire black venture capitalists, then people would invest their money with you. People would come to you because not only would black people come, but people who care about equity would come. So I think, and having that diversity of thought and opinion and market. I mean, what does a white woman or a white man know about a black consumer? What they think they know, right? But if you have a black person sitting at that table, they know the black consumer.
Dr. King said all labor has dignity. And he came to Memphis in 1968 to support sanitation workers who were hoping to be recognized by labor unions. Their working conditions improved and fair wages. Labor unions have been a critical part of the growth of the middle class in the 20th century, yet they are under threat today. What should people know about labor unions, collective bargaining, and fair wages in today's terms?
During the first Obama administration, we decided to lift up heroes in the labor movement, and the sanitation workers were one of the groups that we lifted up, and I was amazed. I mean, if 1619 hasn't told us already, I was amazed how many people had no idea what we were talking about when we said the Memphis sanitation workers, when we mentioned by name Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, when we mentioned by name Larry Payne. No one knew who they were. So I think the idea of organized labor is that if we're going to stay anonymous, if we're soon going to forget George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others, if we're soon going to forget the people who brought us to some action, we need a collective voice, and organized labor gives us that. Organized labor, yes, they take union dues, but they don't care about your age, your color, your gender, and we're making great strides. I mean, unions like we mentioned before, like SEIU, has always been, and AFSCME, have always been at the forefront of integrated. Some of the unions have been less speedy to integrate, like the unions, quite frankly, that pay higher wages. And I think that's changing now. I think the world of union is really embracing the fact that they're better with diversity. They speak for everyone. And I think, as you mentioned, the unions were the reason for the growth of the middle class, particularly the growth of the middle class in black and white communities. And if you look at the rise in the poverty and the gap between the richest and the poorest, it really parallels the decline of union membership. So I think if we can really figure out a way to convince young people that organizing, and I think we're doing that now with things like Starbucks, I don't know whether I'm allowed to mention names, but, oops. But I think young people are going to find a way here, and I think we're going to find ways to equalize pay for things like childcare. We're going to find ways to treat CNAs with respect and dignity, not by saying thank you and ringing a bell, but by paying them a living wage, not a minimum wage.
When I think about labor unions, I think they do two fundamental things. One, I think they help us redefine our relationship with work. Yes, we have to work in order to pay for supplies and services and support our families. But when that relationship with work sort of defines our life as opposed to informing our life, it shifts and it changes. And for so many people, life is work because they can't afford to do anything other than work. And for marginalized people, for Black people, that is in so many cases the case. So I see labor unions as really helping us redefine our relationship with work. And I think the second point, which we've all touched on over the course of this tour, is the importance of collective action. What we saw in the 50s and the 60s is we were all marching up the hill together, sort of fighting for social justice and equity. And I think today, because of all of the noise that we have around us, we forget how important it is to fight the same fight, to all row in the same direction. And in many cases, labor unions help us to define some of the key elements that really define equity for our future.
We encourage you to subscribe to the museum's Imagine in America podcast series wherever you listen to podcasts. Send us your comments and share these episodes on social media. For more information, visit imagineinamerica.org. Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.